Understanding Christianity, the Role of the Fourth Gospel, John. Bruce Charlton. The role of the Fourth Gospel in my understanding of Christianity is of a means to the end of understanding. Once I had grasped that understanding, from then the validity and authority of the Gospel became almost irrelevant. Much as if it were a work of explicit fiction that expressed truth, like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. But, in order really to engage with the Fourth Gospel, I needed to be convinced it was worth the sustained and intense effort that was required. Of all the Bible, I was most sure of the authority and value of 4. That was my starting point. I felt sure that, if truth were to be found, that's where it would be. So I was able and keen to put in the effort of grappling with 4, and then it yielded a clear and simple understanding. But the truth of that understanding was then discerned by intuition, by my deepest attainable sense of inner sureness. This intuition was something tested across time and in whatever was emerged or struck me, as life continued, as challenges were encountered. As I used my the Fourth Gospel understanding in living. The new understanding worked. And at a certain point I felt a strong sense of yes, this is real and true. That's how things happened for me. We can choose what we want to be, but we cannot choose to be it now. Bruce Charlton. We can choose what we want to be, but we cannot choose to be it. This is a fundamental basis of what Jesus taught and made possible. That we cannot, in this mortal life, be what we want to be is innate common sense and confirmed by observation and life experience. Yet it is often denied. Promises of ways of enabling our will for ourselves to be enacted in mortal life now, are recurrently dangled. What Jesus promised relates to what we can choose to become after death. But people, including, for instance, the Apostle Paul, want what they want now, and get very frustrated when it does not happen now. Countless numbers of people have been put off, driven away, from Christianity, because it failed to enable people to become what they wanted to become, or ought to become, during mortal life. Having projected their misunderstanding onto Jesus, they then regard Jesus' failure to transform their mortal lives in the desired fashion now, as a refutation. This mortal life now is highly relevant, vital, to choosing what people want after death, and what we experience and learn in mortal life affects our eternal nature. But the reason Jesus promised resurrected eternal life in heaven after our death, is that this outcome is not possible in this life now. Salvation is therefore about choosing what we want to be. But if we want what Jesus offered, i.e. resurrected everlasting heavenly life, then salvation cannot be about achieving now, that which we desire for eternity. Indeed, if we desire salvation, we can choose to want it, but cannot be what we want to be without Jesus. Our job in mortal life is to want salvation, and then wanting it, we will realize that we cannot have it except by Jesus. We have the innate capacity to want salvation, but cannot be saved, without Jesus. Jesus was necessary that resurrected eternal life be possible, and Jesus is necessary that we personally can be saved. Sex in the universe. William Wildblood. Sex is the basis of the universe. It is the foundation to everything as the one becomes two in order to manifest and know itself more fully. Call this spirit and matter, God and creation, subject and object, it amounts to the same thing. The two are always trying to return to oneness, and it is this that provides the creative tension necessary for anything first to be and then to develop and evolve. Sex means metaphysical sex, of which the physical is a lower order reflection in matter. Sex is the most powerful thing in the world, but it points to something much greater than itself, which is why it can lead to the greatest elevation and, when despoiled or corrupted, the greatest degradation. But even then it is never evil, just the perversion of a supreme good. In the human sphere, sex appears as man and woman, which is the expression in creatures, created beings, of spirit and matter. Each have both within them, but there is a polarity to each which is different. This points to an important truth, one rejected in our time but understood though often misused in the past. These two are complementary, but they are not equal and opposite. In any complementary pair, one is ontologically prior, the other appearing as its reflection in duality. In this case, it is spirit which precedes matter and, by extension, the male precedes and therefore should lead the female. If that is not the case as now, when feminism has denatured humanity, then societal breakdown will ensue and end in chaos, which is the degeneration of form to raw material. Male and female represent the vertical and horizontal axes of life, one pointing to transcendence and higher reality and the other to this world and material being, nature, earth, the body. Both are part of the whole, but the masculine principle must dominate or spirit will be pulled down into matter, where it will be lost in a psychic miasma. See much contemporary spirituality which is all to do with feelings and healing rather than proper self-transcendence. Only the hero can become divine. That is to say, only the fully developed self can transcend self. Popular, feminized. Christianity ignores this truth, thinking that because anyone who believes can be saved, then all are equal in Christ. All may be one in Christ, but that does not mean that all are equal. There is hierarchy in heaven, and salvation is not theosis. The idea that everyone is saved and when saved equal comes from prioritizing the immanent at the expense of the transcendent. It collapses the vertical to the horizontal. The vertical needs the horizontal to express itself, and to know itself as subject needs object, but it must always be the dominant principle. When the feminine asserts itself over the masculine, which it will often seek to do in a fallen world of competing egos, then what is pleasing to emotions overrides what accords with truth. Nurturing virtues, essential in themselves and in their proper place, become overemphasized and expressed where they don't belong and where they do active harm, such as, for example, by undermining justice and responsibility. So-called compassion, which is not love, is weaponized to pull down higher truths, by definition beyond the mundane, to the point where they can be understood by all. But they are destroyed in the process. The tyranny of the masses becomes the arbiter of truth. This is the law of the horizontal applied to the vertical. The moon transforms the light of the sun and makes of it something very different, mysterious and beautiful, but without that light it has nothing to transform. The Creator has given us signs in the heavens through which we can understand how the dynamics of human interaction should work. If we ignore them, we are straying from the path of truth, and that means we fall into darkness and illusion. This is our state today. To say that the increasing domination of the feminine over the masculine leads to loss of connection to transcendent truth is not to condemn the feminine itself, but the ego-driven feminine. Obviously, there is an ego-driven masculine too, which seeks power for its own ends rather than power in the service of truth. However, there is a difference between corrupted truth and an outright lie. The masculine should rule but for the sake of the masculine, and the feminine not for its own sake, and that way lies proper harmony. If the basis of the universe is sex, then the expression of that is love. In a fallen world, the two sexes become rivals, each drawn to the other but also seeking to dominate the other. It is not right to say the sexes should cooperate, as that is far too feeble a word to express the creative harmony that should exist between them, but they should certainly not compete. Each sex must be true to its essential metaphysical form, in which the male represents the reality of being and truth, and the female that of change and becoming. Then they will find true creative fulfillment. In the end, master metaphysician James Brown summed it up thus: "This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing. Nothing without a woman or a girl." How to be personal but not individual. Groupish but not abstract, my current metaphysical problem. Bruce Charlton. Blogging has been light because thinking has been heavy. I've realized I don't have a clear understanding of intuition, inspiration, influence, that I neither individual nor abstract, because I haven't understood it, I can only express it negatively. When a young child experiences his world, there is an animistic sense of the presence of other consciousnesses, but only a few are of known individuals. How can the unindividual but personal, of beings, consciousness be pictured? Not from a combination of individual consciousnesses, because the primal state is not as fully individualized. The egregore idea has it backwards, or at least is a late development of the medieval type of consciousness. But abstract explanations in terms such as fields, auras etc. aren't fundamental, aren't really real. I need a clear, simple, graspable picture, and I do not have one. However, this is a gap, an incoherence in my worldview that needs fixing, if possible. So, that's what I'm trying to do. Progress on the current metaphysical problem relating to consciousness of beings, personal, individual, groupish. Bruce Charlton. I think the answer to my current metaphysical problem, how to picture a consciousness that is group originating and personal, but neither individual nor abstract, may lie in the individual consciousness receiving consciousness. Suppose that the situation is one in which each being has a permeable consciousness, there is some level of awareness of other beings' consciousnesses. So we begin as aware of other consciousnesses, approximately, other minds, which are included in our stream of thinking without much capacity to distinguish what we are thinking from what they are thinking. And conversely, our minds are leaky and other beings are aware of what we are thinking. To start with, we don't have much ability to distinguish any individuals around us, but experience something like a mass effect of many consciousnesses. We experience a group effect, rather than relationships with individuals. This experienced group effect will operate rather like taking an average, because if we are aware of several or many other beings with much the same relational attitude to us, then this will be more powerfully experienced. This situation is approximated by a very young child, who does not much distinguish self from other consciousnesses, and is initially hardly aware of differences between others. With development, specific individuals emerge from the mass effect, usually the mother at first, then father and any other family members who are concentrated on the child, who have relationships with the child. Presumably this continues with development, but there is always a background and implicit, perhaps unconscious, receptivity to the group consciousnesses that impinge upon us. In brief, therefore, our experience of direct awareness of the consciousness of other beings is some mixture of individual consciousnesses, and a remnant of the primordial and undifferentiated awareness of the combined effects of more than one, perhaps many, other persons. So direct mind-to-mind contact is always of beings, of persons, but these are not always experienced individually, they may be, often are, experienced as groups. What makes us have these experiences is our own consciousness, its degree of development, and the moment-by-moment variations we experience due to variable factors such as the direction of our attention, mood, health, and alertness/sleepiness. So far this feels about right, but will require further thought and evaluation. Hawkbits, Hawkbits everywhere. Bruce Charlton. This is the first year I have been aware of the hawkbit as a dominating flower on areas of grass, city and countryside alike in July and into August, taking over as the buttercups faded. I have always known about these flowers, but never before found out their name. I just used to categorize them as looking like a dandelion, but not. Even as a kid I realized that, while the dandelion had a hollow stem that leaked milky sap, this similar looking flower had a solid stalk. Another difference is that Hawkbits don't make a spherical seed head like the dandelion clock, and that the Hawkbit is much more sensitive to the absence of direct sunlight, with the head closing up at night or in gloom, as does the daisy. Anyway, I have gained considerable pleasure from the Hawkbit this year. Often it has been the only splash of color on the grassy areas of the city. Not quite as glorious as the shining and reflective masses of buttercups, perhaps my favorite wildflower, but very welcome all the same. Hawkbit, remember the name. Is metaphysics important to being a Christian? Here and now it is vitally important. Bruce Charlton. Metaphysics is discourse concerning our fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of ultimate reality. It was the case through much of Christian history that disagreements about what was fundamental reality didn't make much difference to being a Christian, because all the necessary assumptions are natural to children, hence were common to pretty much all of humanity. But things have changed. In our civilization, which dominates the world, the fundamental assumption underlying all of our official and public discourse is that everything that is, the universe, arose without purpose as a consequence of physical laws plus randomness. Most of this universe, the ultimate particles, elements, compounds, water and rocks and gases, are not alive. So life, consciousness, mankind, inhabits a dead reality that has no purpose or meaning. We need to be clear that these modern assumptions are neither spontaneous nor natural. All have been deliberately and elaborately inculcated and are sustained via social systems, education, employment, mass media, propaganda, etc. This is probably the main reason why Christianity, and the other religions, is almost entirely absent from the world, and especially from the West, and feeble when it does exist. Christianity contradicts our fundamental understanding of reality. In other words, Christian faith tries to survive as a thin film of psychologically asserted purpose and meaning, life and consciousness, floating on the surface of a world-pervasive metaphysical assumption of death and nothingness. So Christianity is rootless, unmoored, adrift, and strikes the modern person as arbitrary believing, wishful thinking, and/or psychological mass manipulation. Which would be true if modern metaphysics was valid. As we find it, here and now, Christianity is both rare and weak. The implication is that, unless we focus upon and evaluate our fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of ultimate reality, and reject them, then Christianity will be contradicted by our deepest beliefs. Unless we know, reject, revise our metaphysics, Christian evangelists are wasting their time because real Christianity is doomed. Lacking which, even when Christianity is asserted, it will be incoherent with life and society, therefore experienced as irrational and honestly indefensible. Question: do you believe in God? Answer: what do you mean by God? Bruce Charlton. If somebody asks, do you believe in God? Then the true answer depends on what is meant by God, and there are very wide divergences indeed between understandings what is meant by God, even among Christians. The only valid answer would be some version of, first, what do you mean by God? So you cannot, and indeed should not, answer the question without getting clarification of what the inquirer is assuming about what he is calling God. Otherwise, by saying yes, you are assenting to buy a pig in a poke. For example, my understanding of God, the God in whom I believe, is one that many/most Christians, Jews, Muslims would not consider to be actual God at all, or, at best, only a selective sliver of what they believe God to be. To such people, because I regard the omni-God as false, and indeed incoherent, I am a kind of pagan, whatever my attitudes to Jesus Christ, whatever my desire for salvation. While to me, the omni-God believers, insofar as they are real omni-God believers, rather than those who are merely parroting forms of words, in obedience to the authority and doctrines of their church, are all de facto monotheists. Monotheists, whatever their Trinitarian protestations, and as such they do not really regard Jesus Christ as essential to anything, not even salvation, nor do they believe in evil or freedom. And I regard all omni-God monotheists as metaphysically indistinguishable from proponents of oneness spirituality, and therefore their many practical differences are varieties of incoherent with their metaphysics. I mean that the omni-God is reducible to / metaphysically indistinguishable from the deity of deists, which is not a person, but just is. Such a God deity is the way things are. Answering yes to do you believe in God? Therefore means very little or nothing, and a yes is more like to mislead than enlighten. Of course, in the West hardly anybody believes in God of any kind, so a negative reply to do you believe in God is usual, and informative. But before assenting to belief in God we ought to be clear what we really mean by this, what we regard as vital to our understanding of God. Once someone has honestly, and without veiling abstractions that serve to disguise incoherence or incomprehension, explained what he means by God, he has gone a long way towards explaining how he regards ultimate reality. He has also, potentially, done himself a big favor, because it may be that, once he has explained what he means by God, in terms that he himself can clearly grasp, then he will discover that this God is not really what he does believe or desire, in his heart of hearts. The outrageous imposture of Christian churches as gatekeepers of heaven. Bruce Charlton. Looked at retrospectively, it seems extraordinary that all the major Christian churches went down the path of claiming to be the gatekeepers of heaven, of claiming that the eternal salvation of every individual man depended on the say-so of a church on earth. It is not really difficult to understand this in terms of sociological advantage, in terms of how a church, which is a mortal, material, human institution, can enable itself to grow, survive and expand. It is clearly an advantage in this world, if an organization can persuade enough people that it is essential for resurrected life in the world to come. This applies even when the fundamental basis of the Christian religion is one of the primacy of each individual person's spiritual relationship with the ascended Jesus Christ. While there are insufficient historical records concerning the mainstream Christian churches, the trajectory can be seen for the Mormon Church. Mormonism was built around assertion of the primacy of personal revelation, a direct spiritual relationship between each person and the divine, and a conviction that salvation to a kind of heavenly state was the default outcome for all but the most depraved persons. But the church rapidly developed a gatekeeping role analogous to, although not identical with, the mainstream Christian churches, in that access to the highest levels of eternal heavenly exaltation after death, were asserted to depend upon church membership and the performance of particular rituals on this mortal earth. I suppose that something similar applied to the mainstream churches. For example, the individual and non-church family-like Christianity described in the fourth Gospel, John, lost out to the organizational church by which salvation was institutionally mediated. To be a Christian soon became a matter of formal membership of, and submission to, a defined institution, and participation in official and prescribed procedures. Such gatekeeping claims as churches make, elide the distinction between earth and heaven. Of course anyone can claim anything, and we need to ask why such claims were accepted. I think the ability of churches to make this illusion probably rests on a capacity to provide, albeit briefly and partially, but with some degree of sureness and reliability, experiences of heaven while still on earth. It has been the progressive decline, since medieval times, of Western churches' ability to provide to the mass of people such religious experiences, for example by means of their earthly symbolism, ritual, scriptures, and spiritual training, that has perhaps done more than anything to erode belief in the necessity of any particular church to salvation. And when a person sees through the false claims of any Christian church to gatekeep heaven, this involves a recognition that the church is constructed upon a lie. At this point, most people seem to give up on both church and Christianity, together and altogether. But the proper conclusion is to separate church from Christianity, and then to choose Christianity, while recognizing that any particular church is secondary, may be helpful to our salvation, but may be, and more often, not helpful. But responsibility for our salvation after death is always primarily our own, and a matter of our spiritual relationship with Jesus Christ. My, or your, decision to be or not to be a Christian, and to choose to follow Jesus to eternal salvation, should not be mediated, and cannot be blocked by any earthly church, unless you choose to make it so. The Solar Principle. William Wildblood. By No Means Equal was published a couple of years ago, and I've noticed since then there have been many more books and articles questioning the validity of the modern egalitarian ethos. I would love to think it was because of my book, but I'm not that deluded, especially since it hasn't sold very much. The fact is, this is an idea whose time has come. The flaws of egalitarianism are just becoming more and more obvious, and in every sphere too. Most people approach this from a political perspective, but the real issue is a spiritual or metaphysical one, and everything else follows on from that. As always, get first principles right and correct understanding will generally follow. Get them wrong and one mistake leads to another. Don't we see that everywhere now? Sometimes Christianity is blamed for inspiring this ideology, and there is some truth in that, even if traditional Christians would point to Masonic influences, the French Revolution, Marxism, etc., all the usual suspects. And they are not wrong. But a Christianity emptied of its transcendent qualities can also be blamed, and there always was this seed within in it, even if it took many centuries to grow fully. Christianity is not specifically a religion of spiritual aristocrats, which is at once its strength and its weakness. Christianity is a religion of love, and it's very easy to think that love means equality if that's what you want to think. It doesn't, but it can be misunderstood as doing so. Christianity externalized the mysteries, making them potentially accessible to everyone. This is its glory, but also its flaw. I'm not saying it was wrong to do this. That clearly is not the case, but it is something that was right, which carries certain risks. A previous post referred to the collapse of the vertical to the horizontal that takes place during the end times. This is almost the perfect visual image of egalitarianism. The pole that points to the transcendent is chopped down, and lies flat on the ground, with the result that hierarchical values are abandoned and replaced with those that promote and sustain equality. But the attempts to enforce a spurious equality lead to the loss of individuality and freedom, and also to the curtailing of growth beyond the material. With an irony that would be amusing if it weren't so destructive, the insistence on diversity in the modern world is leading to an increasingly bland conformity. There is probably less real diversity now than there ever has been, partly because of the pressures applied by modern technology, but also because the obsession with equality forces everyone into the same box. The question of equality is something about which it is futile to argue or debate. Those who believe in it do not do so for rational or intellectual reasons, still less those of common sense. They are ideologically committed, and the real question is, why do they wish to deny reality? For some it is because of resentment, for others the search for power, and for many now it is because that is what good people are supposed to think. But ultimately it is because of the rejection of the solar principle in man. What I mean by this is that divine spark that lies hidden in the darkness of the self, and which, when discovered, tended and brought to full flame, makes of man a god. We completely neglect this essential principle now, and even many of those who would say they believe in it substitute man-made imitations, more in keeping with their worldly beliefs, for the true inner light. The solar principle is the connection to transcendence within the human heart. And yet though it exists within, it must also be conceived high up above us as earthly man, like the sun which is its symbol. Normally it is obscured by clouds of delusion and ignorance, but when these part it shines with majesty and glory. No egalitarian can ever find it, because egalitarianism never leaves the earth, the flat ground. The solar principle can only be seen by those who take their eyes off the earth and look up to the sky. As a dog returneth to his vomit. Why plans for making people happier / the world better inevitably go nowhere. Bruce Charlton.
As a dog returneth to his vomit, so a fool returneth to his folly. Proverbs 26:11.
Every day our speech and writing, our conversations and media, the world of academia, medicine, officialdom, news and education, are such all replete with analysis, reforms and strategies for making the world a better place, or making some class of people happier, or less miserable, or whatever. Oh, so many good intentions from so many directions, and unrelenting. Yet it all adds up to a great big nothing burger. Indeed, things overall keep getting worse, the decline being actively fueled by the endless affected attempts at betterment. Why? Because our fundamental understanding of the world is false. In other words, when our basic understanding of the nature of life and the universe is qualitatively wrong, then no amount of quantitative activity will make a dent in things. When deep understanding is wrong, then our sense of the purpose and meaning of life will be wrong, feeble, or, mostly, absent. Socio-psychological therapy and reform constitutes no more than patterns of evanescent ripples that sweep and swirl across the surface of an oceanic swell. When our basic understanding of oceanic reality is that the universe is purposeless, meaningless, and, mostly, dead, then this underpinning assumption is the vomit to which the dog shall inevitably return, again, and again, and again. When men have become such fools as to pretend that they can have purposeful and meaningful mortal lives without anything to underpin this in fundamental and ultimate reality, such folly will always undercut all and any superficial efforts at betterment. Is it difficult and complicated to discern the reality behind official propaganda and the mass media deception? No. It is easy for the good. Bruce Charlton. Those who urge modern people to look behind the deceptions and manipulated of the totalitarian system we inhabit, usually make the process of discerning truth in a world of lies to be terribly difficult and complicated, almost a life's work. But this is not so. The problem is not of that kind. It is not a matter of increasing effort and expertise. The root of the problem is that modern man is easily fooled because he is not good, and does not even want to be good. Discerning that we are being lied to and manipulated all the time is something that any good man, Jesus, for example, would find utterly obvious, a simple matter. It could be summarized as the obvious sense of not believing the words of known liars, combined with noticing that we are being asked to share inferences and interpretations of people and events that lack innate common sense, and are indeed inversions of the good. It is because modern man has chosen, and keeps choosing, to discard innate common sense, and to believe those he knows to be liars, that he makes himself so extremely susceptible to propaganda, so extremely resistant to deprogramming. There are many reasons of expediency, of short-term self-benefit, why so many people choose to believe officialdom, corporate and educational pronouncements, the mass media etc. There are extreme social and psychological pressures to conform with these beliefs. But we also know, without needing to be told, that all these pressures to conform and believe are actually powerful reasons why we must therefore doubt the truth of such coerced belief. A good man would not be so easily, so eagerly, fooled as we are, because a good man would know that a system of idea enforcement by manipulation of personal expediency has nothing to do with reality and truth, but implies exactly the opposite. It is the powers and servants of evil who claim that coercion and appeals to selfish and hedonic expediency are reality and truth. And this applies also when the coercion and appeals to hedonic expediency come from within religions, including from within Christianity. It is modern man's lack of goodness, our lack of commitment to live in accordance with divine creation, that makes us so very easy to fool, and so very resistant to undeception. The necessary evils of civilization lead to the ascendancy of chaotic evil under conditions of modern consciousness. Bruce Charlton. I am pessimistically convinced that the chaotic evil of the self-imploding Western totalitarian system is going to prevail, and for deep, inescapable reasons. If we survey the history of civilizations, it is always apparent that each is characterized by necessary evils, most often in the form of human coercion and manipulation. All military and police activities are an example of necessary evils, and all religions include them as well. Nonetheless, in the remote past some civilizations, for example ancient Egypt, Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, were intrinsically stable and lasting, although any society can, of course, be overcome by attack from a more powerful external threat. The contrast is with civilizations that destroy themselves, whether passively by neglect and or by stupidity, or, as now, actively, with self-hatred and by value inversion. My understanding is that this multi-generational innate stability of ancient civilizations was made possible by a more groupish form of human consciousness, whereby there was a spontaneous, mostly unconscious, sharing of awareness between people, especially when there were hereditary links. In such conditions, it seems that the necessary evils were tolerated long-term for the benefit of the group, such group benefits as civil peace, defense against invasion, stable food supply, greater comfort and convenience, and the consolations and joys of religion. Necessary evils were tolerated, but more importantly they were constrained, confined, encapsulated, so that the evil did not expand, and destroy the society. It is this restriction of necessary evils, preventing their longitudinal increase, that has become impossible in modernity. It has always been the case that individuals, especially the most powerful individuals, had to give up personal gratifications to attain these group benefits. This happened in the past, I am suggesting, due to spontaneous and unconscious reasons, sometimes from to genetic relatedness between the rulers and the ruled, and or from a shared and powerful religion. However, human consciousness has changed, and become increasingly more self-aware and individual, especially over the past 200-300 years. So that powerful individuals are now much more aware of their own personal wants and how these conflict with the good of the group, more aware of their immediate and certain gratifications and how these differ from long-term probabilistic benefits, and they lack the unconscious and spontaneous sense, and duty, of being immersed inside a valued societal group that would once have constrained such selfishness and short-termism. In spiritual terms, in the past individual evils were, most of the time, innately restrained by groupishness, whereas with modern consciousness this has ceased to be the case. Furthermore, all historical societies functioned inside religion, their worldview was involuntarily through the lens of religion, which was larger than any individual. This is a generalization, albeit a strong one, but there probably were exceptions, when an individualistic, perhaps psychopathic/incapable of empathy, individual would act with increased selfishness and callousness, e.g. Caligula, or would disbelieve the state religion and therefore broach its restraints. For example, some of the perpetrators of the great horrors of history probably ensued, when such a person was in a position of power, for example Akhenaten. The situation at present is that all the nations and international groupings of the modern world, even the better ones, even the best of them, are totalitarian in nature, which is a kind of lawful evil, and, as such, are net evil. All our societies in which the civilizationally required elements of necessary evil are very strong, and core, and ineradicable. Which is why, especially since the 1960s, there has been such a strong countercultural tendency, rooted in opposition to the particular necessary evils, but, dishonestly and fatally, without understanding or acknowledging that such evils are inevitable, in any possible civilization. Add to this that evil is not static, but tends to feed upon itself and increase, especially when evil is unrepented, as happens, usually, when evils are necessary to continued worldly survival. Thus I believe and have often argued that, under modern conditions, lawful evil degenerates inevitably into chaotic evil, due to the, sooner or later, irresistible pressure of increased selfishness and short-termism among those with power. I get a strong sense that exactly this is happening, that the agents of lawful evil are progressively weakening, and those of chaotic evil are strengthening, at a world civilizational level, and that will become evident very soon, perhaps within a few days. Because of the compromises, i.e. necessary evils, of modern totalitarianism, and because of the nature of modern consciousness, modern societies cannot hold the line at the necessary evils of a nation. The necessary evils will expand, and the goodness will be eroded. So, I mean that there will be, under whatever lying disguise, and will the self-blinded collusion of the totalitarian bureaucrats, a major action that will tend to provoke global chaos. But if not now then soon, because there are no countervailing material powers that are sufficiently aligned with good, and sufficiently strong/cohesive, to stop and reverse the waxing trend towards chaos. A motivational explanation of lawful evil, and its development into chaotic evil. Bruce Charlton. Lawful evil is totalitarian, and systemic evil. Its core aim is to create a machine for the corruption, and eventual damnation of mankind. For this ultimate goal to happen entails the participants foregoing the upfront gratifications of short-termist and purely selfish satisfactions. Lawful evil embodies some virtues, or partial virtues, some at least somewhat positive values, in service to its long-term goals, values such as obedience, loyalty, hard work, deferred gratification. Chaotic evil is, by contrast, short-termist and selfish, but the gratifications it seeks are of a negative kind. In Dungeons and Dragons terminology, the earliest most primitive form evil, coming before lawful, which comes before chaotic, is mostly positive in its rewards, and might be termed neutral evil. I mean the evil that seeks short-term selfish gratification of a positively rewarding kind, such as the gratification of greed, lust, excitement, luxury, etc. Chaotic evil is therefore spiteful, it seems to harm others more than to benefit itself, or, more exactly, its greatest self-benefit, its greatest pleasure, is the harm of others. The negative gratifications of chaotic evil are a late corruption of evil, developing after someone has been sated or jaded by positive rewards. Therefore chaotic evil is primarily motivated by emotions such as resentment, revenge, and sadism. Ultimately, both lawful and chaotic evil are motivated by hatred of God and divine creation, and indeed anything created or creative. Lawful evil will always trend towards chaotic evil, because lawful evil entails doing some good in order to achieve a greater evil. Therefore, every individual who serves lawful evil will continually be tempted by the opportunity for me to do immediate evil, here and now, breaking the laws of lawful evil, instead of putting off present temptation in order to pursue some delayed overall goal. So, lawful evil is intrinsically unstable. The closer lawful evil gets to achieve a system of damnation, the greater the commitment to evil goals of the system participants, and the greater the opportunities for doing evil ahead of time, and reaping the rewards personally rather than vicariously. Thus it was that when lawful evil achieved its goals of a global totalitarian system in 2020, in the Birdemic coup, within weeks the system had begun to self-destruct with chaotic evil, e.g. with MLB anti-racism, and then escalating chaos and wars in many nations and on many fronts. A lesson of Tolkien's Numenor: mortal life can only be partly enchanted, even in Faery. Bruce Charlton. The sadness that underlies all the best accounts of the interactions of men with elves, fairies and the like, is that the enchantment of Faery is only partly available to men, either for a finite visit or by incomplete inklings. Faery seems greatly desirable and greatly satisfying, in that its sense of beauty and pervasive life and consciousness is so powerful as to satisfy our cravings. Yet such satisfaction is always cut short, or diluted by a countercurrent of self-consciousness, and the ultimate inescapability of death. If only men feel we could live forever is such a situation of enchantment, that would be enough. Life might be complete. Our existential dissatisfaction would at last be stilled. It is this brevity and partiality that mislead, because men never get to see the limitations of fairy life, the different intrinsic sadness of existence for even immortal elves or fairies dwelling in paradise. We clutch and cling to the hope of fairy enchantment, until the if only becomes an always increasing obsession. This is one significance of J.R.R. Tolkien's story of Numenor, in which the more closely that men attain to the enchanted life of elves, the more deluded they become concerning its ultimate sufficiency. The problem begins as a close friendship with the Eldar tinged by an envy of elves' immortality, which was the only substantive difference between Numenorian men and the Eldar. But as the delusion gets a grip that elven immortality will complete men's happiness, Numenorian men become hostile to elves, thereby avoiding the kind of personal association that might disillusion them about the imagined guaranteed bliss of life as an elf. Tolkien was, it seems, strongly aware both of the impossibility of a wholly, or even mostly, enchanted life for mortal men, and also aware that even if it were possible to live always in Faery, this would not provide a full answer to our existential yearning. This is because the happiness of immortal elves becomes overwhelmed by the nature and effects of continual living in a world where there is death and evil. This means that loss is both inevitable and cumulative, and the memory of times before loss is an increasing burden. To me, it seems that elven bliss could only be complete if elves lived in the here and now of a paradise but without memory, so that losses would be forgotten. This would mean that awareness, memory, intelligence would all need to be reduced to a bare minimum, if not deleted, and elves would decline to a lower, animal-like or plant-like, state of consciousness. For Tolkien, there were other possibilities for men, and these included a escape of the spirit to a world without time or change or else, or perhaps as well as, the life of spirits reborn into this earth but, somehow, purged of death and evil. For me, the reason why mortal life is only partly enchanted is ultimately because mortal life is a transitional stage between life as pre-mortal spirits, and the possibility of a future of resurrected eternal life in the new creation that is heaven. Why the biggest Western civilizational strategies have zero validity. A multi-level explanation. Bruce Charlton. It is an interesting aspect of the most recent giga-dollar projects, schemes and strategies, characteristic, especially, of Western civilization in its end stage, that they consist almost entirely of colored lights, smoke and mirrors, vapor and blank assertion. Among currently active projects of colossal size, scope and expense, there is the climate scam, the Birdemic/Peck scam, the anti-racism scam, the AI scam, and the war everywhere scam. These all share 1. An absence of mass and grassroots origins or support. Such projects are imposed, top-down, multinationally. By simultaneously coordinating the many functional specializations, and integrated goals and bureaucratic media methods, of the global totalitarian system. 2. An absence of coherent reality in terms of need. Ends and means are alike invisible to personal experience. The rationale for these projects is wholly manufactured, and disseminated by research and mass media propaganda. 3. An absence of rational credibility for the effectiveness of the vast schemes of intervention. No demand, no coherence, no genuine need, no potential effectiveness. There must be some reason why nothing Berger projects are consistently chosen, in preference to schemes addressing real needs by valid measures. In fact, there are many reasons and at many levels by which to understand why strategy is rooted in and aimed at nothing, rather than something. At the deepest, spiritual evil level, it seems obvious that to organize the world on the basis of nothing fits with the nihilistic, anti-divine creation stance of the demonic motivation. Insofar as creation is subverted by incoherence and lies, the anti-God alliance is winning. At the level of the most powerful human leadership class, a strategy based on nothing is, once established and launched, impossible to refute. Nothingness cannot be critiqued on the basis of either data or individual human experiences. At the level of the puppet leadership class, those heading the nations, major corporations and most significant institutions, the only requirement is that strategies be backed up by the largest possible, and longest sustainable infusions of money and other resources, so that multiple forms of, mostly legal, corruption can redirect benefits to their pockets. And when the entire project is phony, then such vampirism is less noticeable and less likely to be suppressed than would be the case if there was a real problem being addressed by a potentially valid solution. Consider CO2 climate strategies or the Birdemic PEC. When the whole vast theoretical scheme is shaped from nothing and lies, then nobody really expects anything to work, and they wouldn't know if it did. In consequence, nihilistic indifference prevails, and nothing is done to prevent, limit, or punish the overwhelming incidence of tyrannical self-enrichment, expedient policy contradictions, and obscenely flagrant hypocrisy. At the level of senior and mid-level bureaucrats/managers/intellectuals, these types are indifferent to content, and wholly focused on proximate matters such as careers and status. They will willingly say and do anything required of them by their bureaucratic superiors, so long as this aligns with incentives, and will eagerly manufacture the necessary rationale or obfuscate the obvious, on demand. At the level below the middle managerial myrmidons of evil, it does not matter what the masses think about these projects. The schemes are done to such people, whose only job is to do the needful stuff and provide the necessities of living. The masses are the despised host, whose existence merely enables the thriving of an extractive parasitic superstructure. In sum, there are many reasons, from upfront and proximate to long-term and ultimate, why it suits the totalitarian system to prefer ruling the world on the basis of nothing, rather than something. The Pain of Exile. William Wildblood. Every person who has any real spiritual sensibility suffers from being in this world, and the more sensibility you have, the more you suffer. As much as you may love certain aspects of this world, you know it is not your real home. For that matter, the you appear to be in this world is not the real you either. You know there is a greater self somewhere beyond the one you experience in the here and now. There is always this existential ache, but you are fortunate, for it is this that drives you to seek out deeper levels of truth than what the world has to offer, even in most of what it provides in terms of religion. Your spiritual pain has another purpose too, one beyond the impetus towards personal growth. This world is sunk in darkness and separated from its source. The suffering of those who are aware of the soul helps lighten some of that darkness by aiding in reconnection. This is because it is a transmuting element that opens up the world through you as a part of the world to the higher spiritual that you can sense. Therefore, whenever you may feel particular pain or anguish, know that you are bringing light into the world through that pain, because you are, in however small a degree, piercing the shell of materialism that surrounds the totality of human consciousness. You are letting some light into the world. While you are in the world, you are part of it, and as a part that is somewhat conscious of higher reality, you help to bring that reality into the world as a whole. In this way your pain helps in the healing of the world, which may be a small comfort but should be some consolation. You are serving a purpose beyond yourself. Those who have a foot in both worlds can act as channels between the two in a manner that benefits and uplifts, though they may not know it, many souls on the cusp of spiritual awakening. Why pain, why suffering is the cry of humanity to God. Usually there is no answer, and that causes the faith of many to fail. But if you looked on the fact of pain and suffering as evidence that this is not your natural state, and used it as a motivation to seek that state, you might be better reconciled to it. I am not saying this justifies or fully explains suffering, but the deepest love comes from the knowledge of suffering, which breaks open the self. God himself suffers through his incarnation in matter, and yet he joyously gives himself so that his creation might grow and become more like him. The topic of initiation is one which the modern world, egalitarian, democratic, materialistic, has quite forgotten. However, in many traditional societies it was an important concept which could be applied on a variety of levels, from the everyday, the movement from boyhood to manhood, for instance, to the deeply spiritual. Fundamentally, initiation means the transition to a different mode of consciousness, and it always involves a kind of death. In other words, there is no initiation without suffering, and the further one progresses on the spiritual path, the truer this is. The suffering comes about as part of the outgrowing of a previous phase of being and indicates you are being prepared to move to a higher phase. Suffering leads to death, which in turn leads to rebirth. There is no proper initiation without suffering, so let those who do suffer spiritually understand that this is a sign they are being prepared for a new and higher state of being. The coming bust will be epic, but so what? Francis Berger. I do not know when it will happen or how it will happen, but when I contemplate the evil, dishonest, and foolish voodoo that passes itself off as economics and financial markets these days, I cannot help but see that it will all come crashing down, soon, probably a lot sooner than most expect. When it does finally happen, I suspect it will be worse than a mere downturn or a garden variety crash. Think bust. Big time, epic bust. The sort of bust that happens only once every century or two. And what then? Probably not much, at least not from a spiritual perspective. The kind of spiritual revival our world needs cannot stem from such an external event, not even if it happens to be of epic, civilizational altering proportions.